From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now here's your moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss with you what we believe to be a very serious topic, and we know it is, and important. We're dealing with human sexuality and, of course, the issue of AIDS. This particular disease received a lot of attention recently when Magic Johnson announced to the world that he is HIV positive. We have dealt with this subject before, but certainly it is time to do it again, and particularly with this new emphasis. Some of the things that we will be discussing, we will use rather candid language, and it might not be appropriate for some children to view. With that in mind, let us proceed with our program. Today we welcome to the program two very important guests who are highly qualified to address this important issue. I first welcome Jan Schwartz, who is on the staff of the Panhandle Health District in northern Idaho. Jan has been with us before, and we welcome you back once again. We're also pleased to have Linda Paulson, who's been on the program before, and she comes to us from North Idaho College's health department, or student nurse. And Linda, again, welcome to the program. We're back in our studio. We've been over at Channel 7 this fall while we remodeled our studio, and we're very thankful to KSPS, and we're happy to be home to be able to continue our programming and back with my regular panel. And I first of all welcome to the program from the panel Janelle Burke, who is an attorney, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
The first round of questions is going to deal with some background information. Linda, can you tell us what exactly is AIDS?
AIDS is an acronym for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, and it's actually a part of the whole process or the whole spectrum of the HIV infection. HIV is the virus that actually causes AIDS. It's the virus that's why Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive, indicating that he's had a blood test which shows that he has been exposed to the HIV virus. The HIV virus gets introduced into the body, and it causes an effect on the white blood cells that destroys them. And eventually, over time, and it can be any length of time, but usually anywhere from 5 to 10 years, as the white blood cells become more and more destroyed and are not able to defend the body against normal types of infections, along the lines of that spectrum, people may begin to develop some symptoms. They may begin to develop more and more deficiencies to the point where they develop what are called opportunistic infections, which are infections that take advantage of the body's decreased immune system. At that point is when someone would be diagnosed with actually having AIDS.
And that's what kinds of diseases are those that might
diseases,
take advantage?
One of the most common and probably the most predominant is pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or called PCP pneumonia. Another one that is Kaposi sarcoma. There are certain types of cancers. There are just the list is probably almost endless. Some of them are common types of diseases that people might not normally get, or might get and would get and get well and not have any problems with. Many of them are diseases that most of us have been exposed to, that we carry around within our own bodies, but because our immune systems function, we don't get them.
So, Jan, is this a problem in our area? Somehow we seem to think that it happens far away to people that we don't know. What about what's happening right here in the inland Northwest?
It's a real easy thing to look at HIV and assume it's someone else's problem. Nationally, we're looking at over 196,000 people that have been diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. And in Idaho, we are considered a low prevalence state. We've had 107 cases reported here since yesterday. And in North Idaho, 1/4 of those people reside here. These are 27 people with full-blown AIDS. And we have a reported count of another 27 with HIV infection that are not ill yet. So it is here in North Idaho, and we need to address the issue of AIDS and HIV infection.
Steve Schenck.
Well, I suppose sooner or later we need to get to the topic of how AIDS is transmitted, and with the awareness going up, I'm sure that there is an increase too in fear, and some of that fear is a positive thing, some of it is not. Linda, could you tell us a little bit about how the AIDS virus, HIV virus, is transmitted?
HIV is transmitted primarily through transmission of blood and through sexual transmission of semen and vaginal secretions. Those are the three body fluids, if you will, that have the highest concentration of the virus. Early on, we talked a lot about the virus being transmitted via body fluids, and people worried a lot about saliva and sweat and tears and urine and any number of things. And those are really the three main modes of transmission. And of all the things that have changed as we're learning more and more about HIV and AIDS infection, those are the three things that have remained consistent, is that the transmission is through blood, semen, and vaginal and cervical secretions, where there's the highest concentration of the virus.
Jan, could you debunk a few myths for us? What are some of the misimpressions that you deal with regularly on the part of the general public about how AIDS is transmitted?
Sure. And adding one thing to Linda, they came out recently and said that breast milk now is considered a infective body fluid, and that women who are HIV positive who given birth must be very cautious and not breastfeed their children. One of the things that I think we've seen here in North Idaho is that we're beginning in the second decade of this epidemic. In North Idaho and rural areas, we're looking at our first decade. And that apathy that was bred in the first decade is now ignorance. Getting questions in terms of, can you get it from kissing? Can you get it from mosquitoes? Those are things that were proven years ago are not really issues of transmission, but still getting those questions. The old research on mosquitoes finding out that HIV virus cannot infect the mosquito, thusly not making the mosquito infectious to others, and also does not have the mechanism to give back the blood it took from someone else. And so getting rid of that myth. And you get the questions, well, if you ate Doritos, then your mouth might be bleeding and you might then kiss somebody and get HIV. And I think we have to be reasonable in terms of transmission. That's not what we're seeing.
You're talking about how we have grown in education about this particular issue, Jan, and certainly television's had a lot to do with this nationally, and that's what we are trying to do in this program, to enlighten. Also, as the disease received its first major attention in the earlier mid-'80s, it was often directed that certain classes or groups of people, certain population communities, were the ones that received HIV positive and later AIDS. Can you lay that myth to rest and talk about in the terms of that was stereotyping or directing the issue at only a portion of society?
Sure. Early on in the epidemic, we talked about high-risk groups. Gay men were a high-risk group. Haitians were a high-risk group early on in the epidemic. You know, later on in the epidemic, into the 90s, we look at not who you are, but what you do, putting you at risk for HIV infection. It doesn't matter whether you're gay or not. If you are practicing high-risk behavior, you are at risk for HIV. Adolescents are not homosexual, but if their behavior is risky, they are then at risk for HIV. So we've really abolished the group concept and looking at individuals and their behavior and their decision making.
And we're going to get into a discussion of some of the preventive processes a little later in the program. So in relation to my question, though, your response is that individuals, if they engage in certain types of behavior without certain preventive methods and so forth, that any person is subject to becoming HIV positive.
Absolutely.
Janelle Berg.
Since both of you deal with the population of teenagers and young people, I want to ask some questions about the debate that's currently raging as to prevention. Some people are saying that there should be abstinence, and that abstinence should be, of course, practiced and preached and practiced. Can you tell me what your position is, or how you see the problem developing? And let's start with Jan first, and then go on to Linda.
I got to do all the fun stuff. I think as parents, we look at our children and we think abstinence is what we want for them. But I've spent 6 years in the high school talking with adolescents about safer sex and about HIV. And with their input, I know that abstinence is not the only thing that we can teach them, that we owe them more information, not to just say no, but to just say no, K-N-O-W, know exactly what they can and cannot do, know exactly what they need to do to protect themselves. And we have an obligation to do that.
And Linda, what kind of things are you saying as you see young people?
And probably I agree with Jan. As a mother of a young girl who will be getting into adolescence soon, it's frightening to think about it, and I know that abstinence is a real positive message. I also know from working here at the college and also having spent 8 years at the health department in family planning and sexually transmitted diseases in Boise, that we've all been preached abstinence and taught abstinence for years and years and years, and it's not something that is real for everybody. For the people for whom it's real and for whom it fits, it's a good thing. It's going to prevent you from a lot of problems, physically and emotionally and so forth. But the reality is that a lot of people are not doing it, and so my belief is that we need to teach them, if they are choosing to be sexually active, they need to know what they need to do to protect themselves from HIV, from pregnancy, from other sexually transmitted diseases.
So you're lumping more than just HIV and the AIDS into this whole process. And so then what are you telling young people are ways of prevention other than abstinence? Jan?
When I talk with adolescents, say in high school classrooms, my preference is to talk to them about monogamous abstinent relationships where kids can agree with their partner not to have intercourse. The pressure isn't there then. You know, they have somebody to lean on, and they don't have the pressure of honey, if you love me, you'll do this. You know, because they have agreed in a mature level not to do that. And then I talk to kids about sexually active monogamous relationships where you're still with one partner, but adolescents have a hard time being monogamous, and talking about the use of safer sex, the use of condoms and spermicide, even in that monogamous relationship, to make sure that they remain safe.
Do you have something to add there, Linda?
No, only that one of the things that comes up a lot is a lot of young women are on birth control pills. And they will say, well, I don't need to worry about using condoms because I'm on the pill. And the pill gives you great protection against pregnancy, but it doesn't give you any protection against HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. And so if someone's on the pill and they're sexually active, they still need to be using condoms and a spermicide with it.
Steve Sheen.
Jan, you talked earlier about the fact that in this area we're in the first generation. Was generation the term you used, or first decade?
Of our own epidemic.
How are we doing in terms of getting the problem under control? In other parts of the country where the AIDS threat has been around longer, is progress being made in terms of transmission and the number of new cases? And are we behind that curve? Are we still on the upswing, or are we getting a handle on the disease here?
Oh, I think we're clearly on the upswing in terms of identifying HIV infection and seeking those individuals to get in for treatment and management of their disease. You know, we're clearly still on the upswing. In larger communities, they have resources that are available. We're still limited on our resources for people with HIV infection. So as we find them, we scramble to find the best resources for them.
Well, let's talk a little bit about one of those resources, and I'm referring to education. I've got to believe that if there's an AIDS hotline in this community, the phone's been ringing since the Magic Johnson announcement. Who should call and ask for assistance, and where should they call? Is that a better question for Jan and Linda, or whomever?
They can call for folks in the general community. They can certainly call Panhandle Health District. They can call the national if they have general questions, and at Panhandle they can have testing done to find out if they are infected with the virus, if they have evidence of the antibodies. They can go there for other types of sexually transmitted disease counseling, and they can call the Panhandle number, which is 667-3481.
Let's go back that again. That's
Okay.
area code 208 for some people.
Right, 667-3481.
Okay.
And if they have general questions and they're afraid that someone might recognize their voice or something of that sort, all the information is very confidential. Secondly, they could call the national hotline number, which is 1-800-342-AIDS.
Jan, a quick follow-up to that. When would you recommend that someone get beyond that stage and actually go in and be tested? Or do you recommend that?
I think my bottom line feeling on that is if the issue of AIDS and HIV disease is causing you anxiety, then you need to be tested. And if it's something that doesn't seem to be a concern to you, then maybe you don't. But if it's causing you anxiety, be tested.
I think that, as I said at the beginning of the program, we're going to use some rather candid language, but that's what it's all about, to help people. And one of the great successes in life is the preventive process, not only in this but in other fields in life. We spend so much time dealing with things and not talking about preventive. And Jan, you're so articulate in this, and we've dealt with it before. I want to start with you and then ask Linda to assist. We've heard so much about that HIV positive as a result of certain sexual behavior. We also hear that it deals with drug use, and in some individuals, once that they are HIV positive, they give blood, of course, in transfusions. That could be the other source. I want to start with the human sexuality issue, and I wish you'd share with our viewers, in particular the teenagers that might be watching, or people who are very active sexually. Would you go through, as you would if they were visiting your office, and give instructions on sexual activities that increases greatly the risk of HIV positive?
I think what caught my attention was when you said some types of sexual behavior. Basically, all types of sexual behavior that involve exchanges of body fluids are going to put you at risk for HIV, whether that's oral, vaginal, or anal intercourse. They're all going to put you at risk for HIV infection. And I would share that with a client coming in.
Yes. Would you, you or Lindy, the one, be very specific that I know you've talked about using a condom, for example, is a, you believe, a very helpful thing. But would you agree or disagree that certain sexual acts are more likely to increase the chances of infection? Linda, would you like to take that?
Anal intercourse is probably the type of intercourse that is the most apt to cause an infection, unprotected anal intercourse. And then vaginal intercourse, and then oral sex probably less likely to, but still a possibility. There have been a few reported cases of people who have become HIV infected only from oral sex. And the person that's most apt to become infected is the recipient of the insertion of the process. So it doesn't matter whether. One of the things that's a common misconception is that the only people that have anal sex are people who are gay. Many gay people never have anal sex, and there are a lot of heterosexuals who have anal sex as well. But it's primarily anal sex is the highest risk, vaginal next, and oral sex the last.
Also, when individuals are having certain kinds of physical problems, don't they increase the chances of, in reading about the whole process, that if there are certain kinds of sores or cuts and so on, and in your sexually active time, you do increase the chances of getting into the blood system?
Basically, anytime you have any sort of open lesion on the skin, no matter where it is on the skin, you have an increased risk of blood getting into that, and the virus is primarily in the blood, so that's where you run into your transmission modes. You know, your increased rate of transmission.
Causing a break in the skin, making it more apt to be able to enter the body.
And that's why I think that you also made the point that, for example, dealing with anal sex, that there's more of a chance too also of that problem of a break and so forth. If we can get into the issue of those who are like drug addicts and use needles and so forth, share with us the whole issue of drug use is a great problem, but that if you engage in certain practices with needles, don't you increase the chances of having the infection? Would one of you take us through that, please?
You know, early on in the epidemic, we talked about intravenous drug users, that they were at risk for HIV if they were sharing needles with someone else who was infected. Now we're looking at needle users in general, regardless of whether they're entering a vein or not, whether they're skin popping cocaine, whether they're injecting steroids, regardless if they're using needles, they are at risk for HIV infection.
And if they use a needle more than once, they increase that chance?
If they're sharing with someone else.
Or if they're sharing the needle with someone else. Janelle Burke.
I would like to ask a series of just small questions, but which deal with this area in general. Is it true that once you are infected with the HIV virus, that you can spread that virus immediately? And Linda, would you please comment on this? Spread that virus immediately once you are infected, even though you may not know at this point that you have it yet.
Right. Once you become infected with the virus, you're capable of transmitting the virus to somebody else, even though you may even not have had long enough for the blood test to turn positive, let alone to know that you should go in and get tested, and long before you might ever develop any symptoms or actually be diagnosed with AIDS.
And that is one of the reasons that it would be so difficult to tell in many cases. Is that correct?
Right.
What about people who are getting married? Will the HIV positive turn up on their blood tests when they're getting married, or would that be a safe assumption?
Idaho no longer has any blood tests required for marriage, so there is none of that happening now. When a person applies for a marriage license, they are given a pamphlet which goes through the risk factors involved with HIV transmission and advising an individual if they've participated in some high-risk behavior, they should be tested. In North Idaho, we have several young couples. Had they been tested at the time of marriage, one of them would not be infected now, but neither of them knowing going into a marriage with an infected partner.
What about some of the kinds of things that we think might spread the HIV virus, but which probably are myths like Steve covered earlier? How about competing in athletic activities? What is the risk involved there?
The risk is probably fairly minimal in athletic activities. The biggest risk would be if there was a player who was infected with the virus, who got some sort of an injury to his skin where he was bleeding or she was bleeding, and another athlete had an open area on their skin into which the infected blood could get into, or a referee or a coach or whomever. But that's primarily the risk that you're looking at, is a blood-to-blood type of a contact. And the virus would need to be able to have a way to get into the other person's skin. If the other person's skin was intact, then you're not looking at a risk of infection. You're looking at an open portal that the virus can enter the body.
Jan, it's my understanding that HIV is just the tip of the iceberg, that actually the STTs, the sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, are the more common and prevalent in our area. And would you please comment on that?
That's very true. Your risk of HIV is nowhere near the risk of other sexually transmitted infections.
And what do we include within that broad category?
Chlamydia is probably the most common in this community, that and human papillomavirus, which causes warts, genital warts, precursor to cancer in some people. Syphilis is on the rise nationally, although we are yet to see a major rise here. It is certainly happening in the larger communities. And gonorrhea remains somewhat of a problem here at times.
But that actually these are more prevalent than the HIV
Absolutely.
virus.
And herpes, oh excuse me, there was a whisper on the side. And herpes simplex virus, which causes genital herpes.
Steve Sheen.
Linda, I know that neither you nor Jan is a medical researcher, but maybe you could tell us, you're certainly better informed, far better informed than the average person is. What's happening in terms of treatment of HIV infection and the AIDS virus?
There really is a lot of research going on, and it's really pretty exciting to see. When I first started working with this several years ago, people seem to have a lot shorter life expectancy than they do now, and we're really beginning to look more and more at HIV as a chronic disease and a chronic illness, as opposed to something that's necessarily terminal in a short period of time for most people. There are a number of drugs, the most common of which is AZT, which people use, which is a drug which inhibits the reproduction of the virus in the body. The list goes on in terms of others. There's been a lot of publicity lately about the new regulations in the FDA to try and get things through a little more quickly. But it's really pretty exciting to look at what they're using for treatment. So far that I'm aware of, there's nothing on the horizon that's a cure, but things that will slow down the reproduction of the virus, which then slows down the disease process.
Jan, let me give you a couple of my perceptions, and you can just say true or false and elaborate a little bit. First would be that people should not put too much faith in medical science's ability to come up with a cure for this disease soon. Don't think, in other words...
Soon as in tomorrow? True.
All right, and then the second one is that I seem to hear, what little I hear, I seem to hear more about a vaccine, something that might keep you from getting the disease if you didn't already have it, than I hear about a cure. So the thought that even if I get AIDS today, before I die, they'll have a cure for it is also probably very dangerous thinking right now. True or false?
I wouldn't want to base my life on a cure coming. We're looking at chronic disease management, being able to maintain an individual with HIV disease like you would a diabetic. Take your insulin shot every day or take your AZT every day, some way of managing the disease. Early on in the epidemic, we were, just as treatments were beginning to be available, ethical questions were coming up on quality of life and why treat them, they're going to die anyway. Those kinds of questions came about to us. These are young people, and you look at chronic disease management and prolonging life with quality, and we can do that now.
I have two different parts I'd like to get into in the time we have left, and one of them is dealing with, it's rather a political question, but I would hope you would just be direct, and I know you as friends that you're willing to do that. I am so puzzled by institutions, sometimes they're colleges and universities and others, that they so shy away with dealing with the problem for political reasons or controversy. What would you say to organizations and institutions that, when I'm talking about adults, dealing with adults, when they won't do such things as have allowed dispensaries for condoms and so forth, would you take the position that if you save one life, it's worth facing the controversy? I've kind of editorialized in asking the question, but would you respond to that, please?
I would, for sure. And just one comment reflecting back on what Steve was talking about. I think that HIV infection is a preventable disease. Nobody else has to really get infected with the disease. Many of the people that are already infected didn't know that. But it is a preventable disease, and to take the risk of getting infected versus because you think there might be a cure, to me is not a risk that I would be willing to take. And I think, and that kind of goes along with your statement. I think it's really unfortunate that people are not willing to risk the controversy, to have condoms available, to talk about them, and to have them available, particularly for adults, and to provide young adults with the information they need to be able to make good decisions.
Jan, we have just a very short amount of time left, but you impressed me so much the last time you were here, because you have worked with AIDS patients, and there's so many times that they're isolated from their family or other society. What advice would you give to our viewers that may find out in the future that there is an AIDS patient within their family, and how to be compassionate and understanding?
It's difficult. I spend a lot of time in the clinic dealing with mothers of, the isolation comes both ways. Oftentimes the individual may be away, but the mother's feeling isolated here comes and spends time. Once the basic education is done and they know they won't catch anything and they know they're comfortable, then you deal with a lot of compassion, understanding and support, because it's very difficult.
It's also my understanding that you have a support group here in North Idaho. Would you like to, we have less than a minute, would you like to tell people how to get in contact with you?
Anybody who is HIV positive that wishes to receive those support services, welcome to call the health department at the earlier number 667-3481 and talk with me about how to access that support group. It's been wonderful for the people with HIV infection and their families.
I congratulate you. I know the panel joins me in your work and serving for the health care in North Idaho, both of you, and thank you for being on our program. You've been very generous with your time. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you found this program very informative to you on a very, very important topic, and we thank you for being with us. And I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week, and we will discuss an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is videotaped live by Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to catch the North Idaho College Public Forum the same time next week on this television station.